Hello and welcome to another Tuesday talking politics and governance in Nigeria. This is Political Paradigm. The presidential and National Assembly elections have now been concluded, and the winner in the presidential election has been declared. The opposition parties believe that there were some anomalies with the process and have decided that they will go to court. The ruling party, on the other hand, believes that this election was well-deserved. Today we talk about the elections, the processes so far, and look towards the March 11 governorship and state houses of assembly elections. We also get reactions from the civil society organizations with regards to observations by the election observers as well. My guest today is the CEO of the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center, PLAC, Mr. Clement Nwankwo. Welcome to Political Paradigm.
Thank you.
Mr. Nwankwo, we are here to talk about the elections and perhaps the challenges ahead, considering the decision we've made as a country and who's in charge now. But let's first look at the decision of the Supreme Court. This judgment has lingered for a while. The Supreme Court has ruled on the CBN redesign policy and has now said that 200, 500, and 1,000 Naira notes should go back into circulation and should run till the 31st of December 2023. This is coming on the backdrop of the president's stand that only the 200 Naira notes would be in circulation for a short period of time, which should elapse in about a month or so. What's your reaction to this judgment?
It's late in coming. People have suffered incredibly with respect to the Naira recoloring policy that the government introduced. And the big issue at this time is not even, for the average Nigerian, is not even about putting back the old currency into circulation. The big issue is that Nigerians returned their old currency to the banks, and the central bank has not printed enough new notes. So if it's a question of us trading in on our old notes, all of our old notes have gone in. Those that didn't go in are the ones that certainly were intended for political purposes. And that's what you have seen some of these governors talk about in criticism of the policy. But that's not the citizens' concern. The citizens' concern is you ask them to turn in their money. They turned it. I turned in all my money. And I'm asking the bank to give me money. And that's not happening. And that for the Nigerian is the bigger question. Yet we expect that the Supreme Court decision would mean that the central bank can reintroduce or recirculate the monies that it has absorbed from citizens and make more cash if it hasn't printed new ones available to citizens so that they can survive this very traumatic, difficult period. So in that sense, yes, it would be a relief for citizens. But certainly what is clear is that whatever purpose it is that the recoloring policy of the central bank regarding the currency, whatever the intention was, obviously it has failed. There will be more currency in circulation. It has exposed the flaws with the banking system. Now we know that the banks have very poor technology. Now we know that the banks have very rudimentary apps that are used. You transfer money to someone who is a beneficiary. They don't receive the money. It's been taken out of your account. So there's just so much. And some advice for the CBN, they should focus very, very strongly on how to build banking technology in this country. You can't seek to get to the apex when the bottom is weak. The Central Bank of Nigeria needs to ask banks, needs to provide for banks to be able to introduce modern technology to deal with financial services. And if you are pursuing what you call a cashless policy and you haven't purchased the technology to deal with it, then you are being dishonest with citizens. And I think that the central bank needs to be honest with Nigerians and admit that there is no technology in existence at this time to help it pursue a cashless policy.
You know, beyond the actions or inactions of the Central Bank of Nigeria, there are concerns as to what this means, what the Supreme Court's judgment means for democracy in the country. I say that because the reactions that have poured in have been tied to the judgment of the Supreme Court, which said that the president acted in error. He didn't consult the Council of State in making that decision, that he failed, or rather he breached the Constitution of the Federal Republic when he issued that directive just after the Supreme Court had given that injunction for status quo to be maintained. What does this mean for democracy? Because Supreme Court judges describe the action as somewhat autocratic and shouldn't obtain in a democracy.
Well, certainly what we have seen in recent times in Nigeria is breach of the rule of law. Following of process has been abandoned by this government. Courts reach decisions that the government disobeys. Courts take decisions, sometimes even are muzzled by the executive to take decisions, which yet the executive does not obey. The rule of law is a major issue. In every country of the world where democracy is practiced, the rule of law is a standard that helps to entrench democracy. Yet in this country, people turn out in the polls, they elect leaders or have leaders imposed on them through what is so-called elections. And those governments come into office and act as if they have no responsibility or accountability to citizens. And that's what we have seen with this government. If you count the number of times it has disobeyed court orders, if you count the number of times it has failed to follow process, then you would see that this country has a huge challenge with respect to rule of law and obedience to court orders. And I think it's been part of the hallmark of this government, which is unfortunate.
You know, many are questioning the timing of the Supreme Court's decision. They believe that it should have come before the elections, but there are those who believe that this was targeted at vote buying.
Please let no one mention vote buying in this conversation, because first of all, it is not the responsibility of central bank to get involved in the conversation around vote buying. Did the Electoral Commission ask the central bank to join?
But you know, the president was involved in the decision as well.
Well, certainly the president, using the instrumentality of the central bank, did pursue this policy. And you know, if I mention central bank, it's really a discussion about the executive. It is not the responsibility of the central bank to get involved in election planning. It has its duty cut for it, and the president or the National Assembly has had a bill called the Electoral Offences Commission Bill, which has been in the National Assembly for years. And if the president is interested in sustainable end to vote buying, that bill is there. It should have been pursued as an executive bill, but it's been pursued today as private members' bills. The Attorney General should pursue that bill to get it passed. The president set up what is called the Constitutional Electoral Reform Committee, and that committee recommended the passage. That committee was headed by Senator Ken Namani. I was part of that committee. That committee recommended the passage of an electoral offences and political parties registration commission. That still has not been even tabled before the National Assembly. So quite frankly, for me, the central bank and the president pursued a political goal with respect to the currency recoloring, and some call it redesign, but I didn't see any redesigning, it's recoloring. And the president and the central bank pursued a political goal with respect to this policy rather than an economic goal. And I think that that's the tragedy of the policy, that it's short-sighted, it's short-term, and doesn't aim to help to develop or improve the economic situation of Nigerians.
You talk about the Electoral Offences and Political Parties Bill that it's supposed to be, that's in the works. And is that different from the Electoral Offences Commission Bill that's been considered now?
It's different because what is being considered is private member bills. Some members, there were 3 different bills that different members of National Assembly introduced, and that is what has been consolidated into one bill in the House of Representatives. The Senate has passed its own version, and what is expected is for the House to finally pass it. It's at third reading stage to pass it, and then it's harmonized by the National Assembly and sent to the President for assent. Now, if the President is interested in reforms, nobody becomes a successful president when you do not have a legislative agenda. Every government that wants to succeed in the executive must work with a legislative agenda. What we have seen in this country is that it's the National Assembly that develops a legislative agenda. That should not be the case. The executive, once you are sworn in, you must have a legislative agenda because that's what entrenches the changes you want to bring about. So this president may have talked about electoral reform, this president may have promised electoral reform, but he never lifted a finger to do one thing on it. The Electoral Act that the president assented to was not an executive bill. The Electoral Offences Commission bill is not an executive bill. There has been no single legislative effort by the executive, by this administration, to improve the electoral process in this country. So using a monetary tool, I would describe the currency recoloring as that, to achieve political or electoral reform, for me, is misguided.
What then would you say about the president's promise just before the elections that he would guarantee a free and fair process beyond the bills that you think that he should have initiated to improve the process?
I don't know how the president has guaranteed that. The elections that have just been conducted have been criticized as one of the worst in our history. So if anything, we may even have taken several steps backwards with the current 2023 general elections that has been conducted by Inec. I have never seen, except perhaps comparable to 2007, this type of election.
That bill you talked about, that's in the works, what would it have done differently? Or how would it have affected this election positively?
It would hold people to account. You do not need to put citizens into great suffering in so-called Naira recoloring or redesign. You would have had an electoral commission in place. That commission will monitor. And I know that the EFCC has been doing some work, but the EFCC's work is not vote buying. Its work is cut out for it. So stretching itself to get involved in the elections is not the intention of the creation of the EFCC.
But that's a financial crime, isn't it?
It's an electoral crime. Now, you can stretch financial crime as far as you want, but then when you spread so thin, it becomes a question, what really are you pursuing? So that's why the Electoral Offences Commission is being requested to be created, because it has a specific goal. And that task is onerous, it's huge. So when you do have a commission which is tasked with vote buying, and we saw in the glaring face of everyone how aspirants to political office bought votes, how the primaries were won by payment of cash by those who eventually emerged. That's the work of an Electoral Offences Commission, because then if that commission was in place, it would track the money, it would track who has been buying votes, it would track how candidates have emerged. And if it is an independent commission, as is proposed under the bill, it will not suffer the perception of political bias or interference. So that's why that bill is being articulated, that's why it's been pursued, and I don't know if the president is interested in leaving a legacy. He still has a few weeks before the end of his administration to pursue that bill is passed.
You know, when you talk about the processes leading to the emergence of these political parties, I'd like to know from you, you monitored this election. You were not only an observer, you were part of the civil society situation room, you had your people out there making monitoring the process as well. Does it surprise you that the opposition parties, some of them, have rejected this result and have decided to go to the court?
Well, elections are conducted, and the whole purpose is that they are not concluded until all of the processes. And unfortunately, courts have become so much a part of our electoral process. And you've seen virtually every single presidential election that is contested in this country go to the courts, and the courts reach a final decision. Now, with respect to the presidential elections in this period of 2023, what we have seen is condemnation of the elections, whether it is international observers or Nigerian observers or the media or citizens. This election has been condemned as one of the worst in Nigeria's history. Now, it is not unexpected that political parties that feel shortchanged have decided that they will challenge this in court. Now, whether these courts are able to provide justice or not, would be us to see how the courts go forward with this. But certainly, from the point of view of an observer, from the point of view of the Nigeria civil society situation, which we're a part of, this election is flawed and is completely below the standards of credible elections.
So when you say that, what are the details from this election that suggest that it is likely the worst election that has been conducted? Because some say that the numbers suggest otherwise. We've never had an election this close to call. Difference between the first and third position, less than 3 million votes. And so many question if it is as bad as it is, because they say that if it was as flawed as it's been put, that the numbers would be way higher. The difference between the ruling party, which won, and perhaps the second position would be way higher.
No, I think that you have to look at the fact that elections were conducted in certain districts, certain constituencies for National Assembly, and same elections for presidential. As we speak, there are several National Assembly elections that have not had results turned in. There are several areas in this country where there are still contestations or even Inec concluding the elections. In 2007, which held the title for the worst conducted election in Nigeria's history, I mean, comparable perhaps to the 1983 elections and then even going back to the 60s. In 2007, we were waiting for results from all of the states of the country, 36 states. We had only seen 13 states when Inec announced the results. With the 2023 elections, we have seen that there are several constituencies where results never showed up. We have seen where figures that are figures attributed to states, to about 2 states, show up in exact numbers. Now, it doesn't take too much. It doesn't require forensic examination to raise questions. So for a lot of people, it's a question, how did you come up with your results? If people were still voting, if Rivers, Imo, some of the states didn't bring in their results, how did you reach the conclusion that you reached?
By bringing the results, you mean upload the results?
Uploading is a different thing. How did you reach the numbers when you couldn't announce results for certain elections held on the same day? You didn't have figures for National Assembly elections in several states, and yet you had figures for presidential elections. The issue of uploading, which was something that you promised to Nigerians, you included in your process and procedures that you told Nigerians would be followed, to which you spoke to publicly, and which you spoke to observers in private meetings and conversations. You failed to do it. So that's what the anger of Nigerians are, really a question, how could you conduct elections where you had established your own processes and failed to live up to those processes? How could you be so opaque, lack so much transparency? How could you fail to explain to people what you really are doing or what you did? You had no answers to questions.
But beyond the guidelines and procedures of Inec, with regard to the law, did Inec err? Because some opposition parties are cited in Section 25 of the Electoral Act. Did Inec err in any way in announcing the results based on what was presented by its returning officers and scopes?
I think that, first of all, when you say to people, this is how you intend to run your elections, and you allow people to take you by your words, people prepared on that basis, then everyone expects you would follow what you have said. It is true that the Electoral Act does not necessarily make it mandatory for you to create a results viewing portal. But it's also true that you had outlined in your regulations and guidelines, and regulations and guidelines at the end of the day, and even your statements of how you intend to pursue the elections, at the end of the day, build up the framework for conduct of elections. And this Electoral Commission did not follow what it has said it would. And that's really what the anger of Nigerians is.
At what level would this have been corrected? Is it at the national collation level? Because the Inec chairman had insisted that there was no way he would pause the process, that whatever needed to be addressed should be addressed after the process had been concluded. What would you have had him do?
Well, I think I watched that period when he said it was going to be reviewed. I did not see where it was reviewed. I think what happened was elections were conducted in the middle, the collation concluded in the wee hours of the morning, in the middle of the night. And there was the next step, which was to announce the results. There wasn't any indication that we have reviewed anybody's complaints, so that was completely out of the question. Now, with respect to review, review comes when election results have been contrived by violence, by fraud, and INEC then uses that opportunity to review it. And it doesn't seem to me that INEC pulled back to say, let's review this. Now, if you look at several of the results, and again, there's the senatorial elections that took place in Kogi State, where it was reported that a governor dug holes around a particular senatorial district to frustrate the conduct of elections. As we speak, there are questions about whether that particular election does not fall into what INEC should review. And if that happened, how come we could get results from presidential elections from that particular district into the collation, but not the collation results? In Owerri, Imo State, apart from several, and Imo State has been a major sore thumb in Nigeria's electoral process since 2020. How come that you could have presidential election results transmit and collated, and yet not one single National Assembly seat has been declared from Imo State? In Rivers State, it was the same issue. So how did you get the results for presidential? So it means that you did not get a complete result before you announce the result of the presidential election. For me, it's disgraceful what has happened with these elections. It's such a shame that close to the middle of the 21st century, this country is conducting this type of elections. Are
you saying that the Independent National Electoral Commission should have held on until all the results were uploaded to its portal before going ahead to conclude on them?
I think that there were issues with elections even before the voting started. I think that if you knew you couldn't deliver materials on time, and I voted in a polling unit less than 3 kilometers from INEC headquarters, so you can imagine what happened in remote constituencies and districts of this country. Polling didn't open in my polling unit till about noon, and polling did not conclude, voting did not conclude until 1:30 a.m. And this was right in the middle of Nigeria's federal capital. So you can imagine what happened across several parts of the country.
You know, some have said that INEC should work on its feedback mechanism and perhaps promptness to addressing issues as they arise. And those who say that do so because they believe that the Independent National Electoral Commission focuses on a result and now announcing results instead of addressing the processes leading up to that. So when you find that returning officers are not filing inappropriate reports, what would you expect the Independent National Electoral Commission to do at the different levels of collation?
Well, if elections did not hold properly, or you saw that elections were not going to hold properly in particular units, particular wards, particular local governments, it was your responsibility to decide that it couldn't go on in a flawed state. And INEC didn't do that. And that's why the question arises as to what kind of results were coming in that INEC was collating. Secondly, INEC, everyone was so happy to see a new electoral act assented to by the president. And the president said everywhere that he went to, he wanted to leave a legacy of good elections. Certainly, this is not good elections, so he leaves no legacy on elections for Nigeria, which is quite a shame. INEC had a lot of time to prepare for this election. It had an incredible amount of time. It set dates way ahead. And then we found that up till the last minute, they were still engaged in bricksmanship. Training of observers in a lot of places did not happen. Ad hoc staff in a lot of places were not sufficiently recruited. INEC came up to say that, oh, it printed even sensitive materials locally. Why was it not available on time? So there's just so much that is wrong with this election that disgraces the country.
When you talk about the Electoral Act, it's been used, it was used in the 2023 general elections, the presidential and national assembly elections for the first time at that scale. But it had been used in the Osun and Ekiti elections, if I recall correctly.
This is the Beavers.
I mean the Electoral Act itself.
Yes.
It was just signed last year. Look at the implementation of the Electoral Acts with regards to how the Osun and Ekiti elections were conducted. And then look at it at the national scale. Then talk to us about the effectiveness. What changes did the Electoral Act bring to this election? Because it does appear that it's a negative feedback we're getting from this Electoral Act, which was supposed to address the problems of our elections.
Now, there's nothing in the Electoral Act that is unfamiliar to INEC. So when people say it's a new Electoral Act, it's not like they were foisted with new circumstances or environment. INEC has been using the Beavers, even if it wasn't so called, since the elections in Kogi State in 2015, when Abubakar Audu died. It was that Beavers or that similar type machine existed during that election. INEC has been using the Beavers in the back room for quite a long time. So it wasn't anything new. What the Electoral Act did was to entrench into law the use of these types of technology. And it was then for INEC, having gotten the backing of the law, to improve on it, but also bring it into public focus, because it was always there. So there's nothing that they needed to learn.
So what's the difference in terms of effectiveness of the Beavers and the card reader? Because this was supposed to be an improvement.
The card reader was that you get a card,
yes,
and it is validated by the smart card reader machines. The Beavers is that all of the information regarding a polling unit is already in the Beavers. And so when you come to a polling unit, in fact, you don't even need...
So it probably improves the process.
It's supposed to improve it,
yes,
because then you don't even need your voter's card. All you need is the identification of who you are. Your iris reading, your fingers, that's what throws up from the Beavers and identifies you. It's one of the best technologies you can have, if it is well used. Because it's also at the same time supposed to accredit you. With a smart card reader, you accredit, then you come back and you vote at a certain time. With the Beavers, it does both at the same time. It accredits you, and then it administers the ballot paper on you, which you put into the voting box. Now, what INEC hasn't shown to us is that it even collated the numbers of persons accredited. And it's something that those who are contesting and challenging this election need to ask for that evidence to be provided, that the Beavers machine actually accredited those who were reported to have voted in a particular polling unit. Where I voted, which was again a problem, had 3,000 persons registered in one polling unit. INEC had told us that that would never be the case. Now, I was 700 and something on the queue. I took my number early in the day, and I voted at 8 p.m., and there were others that voted at 1 a.m. in the same polling unit. Now, once you arrive, the first thing, if there's no queue, you wait. If the queue is short, you wait, you get the Beavers to function, and you vote right away. So there's no question of being accredited and coming back to vote. No, it's a process that is seamless and continuous. So that's, for me, is what is supposed to have improved on the smart card reader. And the question is, did INEC do all of the things it was expected to do? Did it accredit? Because you have to pull in those Beavers machines, especially in states where it is reported that there was huge suppression of votes. Lagos State, a major example. So pull in the Beavers, show us how Lagos voted, show us what numbers were accredited, and show that how that matches with the numbers you have put out for Lagos. Now, it should be shocking to everyone that Lagos that had the highest number of registered voters had just about 1.something million people voting, with the total numbers that we had about 6+ million registered in Lagos. How could you have 87 million persons collect their PVCs and the numbers that voted was just about 25 million?
So that's another thing that's generating reaction. The summary of the Inec election results show that we had a turnout of 27.05%, perhaps the worst we've had since the return to democracy. But many question that. Is that figure plausible?
I think that given the numbers of people who turned out, we had in the Situation Room reports, and some even came into the Situation Room, people who came from different parts of the world, come back to Nigeria. Some arrived on Friday nights, voted on Saturday, left on Sunday, back to Europe, back to the US, back to the Americas. So people came in, people turned up to vote. So this number goes to the question, to what extent did vote suppression reduce the numbers that turned out to be with respect to the final count?
You know, this is part of the reasons why a number of people are pointing to disenfranchisement and questioning this number, saying that there were those who came out earlier to vote, the electoral umpire officials of INEC didn't show up, and that may be responsible for this number, even though they say that this is not the correct number, 27.5. Well, let us look at perhaps other aspects of this election. One of them is security and perhaps safety of the electorate who came out to vote that day. Now, despite the reports of violence recorded in certain areas of across the country, the Inspector General of Police believes that this is one of the most peaceful elections that he's ever witnessed. Do you agree with him?
I think the Inspector of Police, we were very critical of the Inspector General of Police at the onset, and we said he hadn't disclosed to Nigerians his security plan. But I will agree with him that the performance of security, and whether it's the Army, and I listened to the Chief of Defense Staff, General Irabo, I listened to the few times, and he didn't speak a lot, the IG spoke, and then saw the deployment. And none of the reports that we have issued show any serious failings on the part of the security. In the past, it was even of the security personnel, the police, the army, being actively involved in subverting the process. In this election, it was very much reduced, and I think apart from a few states, Rivers, Kogi State, there weren't too many reports of unprofessionalism on the part of security.
How about electoral violence?
There was electoral violence, which was part of the tool of election vote suppression that we saw. We saw quite a lot of that in Lagos. But again, the response of the security was very much more improved in some of the states where this occurred.
Very well, then. There's another thing that comes to mind with regards to this election. As someone who was part of the Situation Room, many have questioned perhaps the effectiveness of the CBN policy which we have talked about. But let me ask you this question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the reports do not suggest that there was vote buying compared to previous elections. Is that what you saw as well?
If you don't see the cash, then you won't see the buying. The question is, were there alternatives that people executed to buy the votes? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. But we didn't see that manifest in terms of people with bags of money on the corners. Yes, but the question is, were monies moving from account to account? Where was cash used that is not necessarily Nigerian money, currency, cash that was used? These are all issues. But quite frankly, the central bank has no business getting involved with trying to deal with vote buying. It's not its mandate. It's not its responsibility. And I do not see how it could have contrived the responsibility for itself in terms of vote buying. There are sufficient security institutions to deal with this. The EFCC was doing its bit, even if I think that it also has no such responsibility. But the Central Bank of Nigeria has absolutely no role to play with respect to elections, and it should not hide its incompetence in dealing with the frustration that Nigerians have over this so-called currency recoloring.
Mr. Nwankwo, expectedly, Nigeria's this election was being looked up to by a number of African countries. Nigeria is the big brother of Africa, so a number of countries were looking up to Africa, including the West, because we had election observers here. Here's how the Financial Times of the United Kingdom posted this. They said Nigeria's badly flawed election fails to set an example. Do you agree with that headline?
Very much so. I think that everyone, Nigeria used to be the head of what they call the Inec, which is the West African version of election management bodies. Everywhere across the world, not just Africa. Nigeria's election, you had record number of observers coming to this country for these elections. You had record number of former heads of states. We had presidents of Kenya, Malawi, Sierra Leone, Liberia, different presidents coming to Ghana, coming to this election to observe. You had the Commonwealth, you had the African Union, you have ECOWAS. All of these agencies and organizations were here. And Nigeria woefully failed to live up to the expectations that everyone had of it. And the damage is incredible. It's not just that INEC was incompetent. It's that this country's image, and you can see the Financial Times, which is read all over the world, put it the way that it has. But all over the world, the damage to Nigeria's reputation by this failure, by these incompetently conducted elections is really, really deep.
But what does this now say going into the March 11 governorship and state houses of assembly elections? There are persons who are discouraged, especially first-time voters, who fear that we may have returned to that era of my vote will not count. What does this say going into the election?
No, I think people should be angry enough to go out and vote. Something that we failed to do as civil society and as civic leaders is to say to people that there is also what is called mandate protection. Because people trusted INEC. People listen to INEC say, as soon as you vote, it reports on the portal. So people went away. So now we know that INEC was lying to Nigerians. INEC did not intend to fulfill its promise. I am angry. I am registered in Abuja, so I wouldn't have the opportunity to vote in the governorship elections because there's no governor in Abuja. But I think that people should be so very angry about INEC's failures. And I'm using failure as a mild expression. Some people think INEC's manipulation of the process. People should be so very angry about this that they determine to come out on March 11 to vote, but not just to vote, be there, see that the votes count and are counted. So let young people know that politics is also local. And at that local level, they should make their choice, they should defend their mandate, and they should ensure that their votes count. And let me also say that INEC must be held to account for bungling this very expensive, and you can imagine what it costs the average Nigerian, this election. INEC, we would come to that point where there has to be an audit of what has happened. And INEC must be held responsible for what it failed to do and for what it did. And that's for those who believe that INEC on its own even deepened the crisis of the elections.
But while civil society organizations condemn these results so much, if you put that side by side with the calls that the elections should be cancelled and redone or rerun, would that be the position of you and others in civil society space? That this election, the presidential election and perhaps the National Assembly elections, should be reconducted?
I think that there are legal ways to deal with this, and we have gone past the stage of saying to INEC, review what came in, because that period has gone. It is now in the realms of the courts. The parties have done what is proper to do, and what we can say to the courts is to prepare to dispense justice, because citizens expect and are looking up to the courts to do what is just and what is right. If there is overwhelming evidence that the elections were very badly conducted, and Kenya did that, countries around the world have had to have judicial cancellation of elections to be able to have it redone. If elections are going to be redone, it's a question who will redo it. Is it the same INEC that everyone has lost confidence in? Or what would the country need to do to have a properly conducted elections? So that would be the dilemma. But I don't see what is there to prevent the courts from reaching a decision to cancel elections judicially, if that is what is the right thing to do.
But that's a concern, isn't it? Because it would seem that the power to declare results or have candidates or have elected leaders has now been given to the courts, which is a problem for every democracy, isn't it? Because it would appear that the people's will is now different from the will of the court, isn't it?
It is unfortunate that an election commission that is set up to manage elections properly has failed, which is what kicks in the powers of the courts. If INEC had done its job, we would have no need to go on to the next stage. But certainly INEC did not do its job. INEC showed incompetence and inability to run an election. And that's why the issue has gone to the court. And that's part of the rule of law in any country. And this would not be the first country that this has happened. So even in the United States of America, the recent elections had issues. You remember when George Bush and Al Gore contested elections? The Florida elections were up for judicial intervention. So this would not be the first time that you would have the courts intervene in an election. All we say to the courts is be bold and make a decision based on the justice of the case, and make sure that people feel justice is done. I think the sense in which we feel elections have been conducted don't rock the boat, so that we would not have instability. We've done that over and over again, and the instability persists and continues and breeds impunity of election officials to distort the will of the people. So I think that if the courts find that this election has been badly run, it will not disrupt the unity of the country if elections are rerun. We've done that with governorship elections. There is a process for managing the country when it is in a rerun election mode. So I don't think the courts should be afraid of doing what is right.
Mr. Nwankwo, in an election process, there are different roles for different people. We've talked about the roles of the security agencies, we've talked about INEC, we've talked about perhaps the civil society organizations and election observers. Let's talk about the conduct of the citizens. In an election that was deemed to be unprecedented following the high level of awareness among people, which saw a high number of registrants for this election, to the point where it almost appeared as though the electoral umpire was overwhelmed. How would you describe the conduct of the citizens in these elections, in the elections?
I think it is very useful, very encouraging to see the numbers. In the polling unit where I voted, citizens provided water, provided drinks for this young ad hoc staff that had to go through the difficulty that they went through. Citizens provided generator, running light into the middle of the night, 2 a.m., 3 a.m. So you could see citizens' involvement. This is not one election where I will agree that there is a low voter turnout. Of course, I have a problem with the voter register. I have said it for a very long time that this country has no credible voters register. And I don't know how you can build every year on what you call continuous voter registration when the voter register is flawed. We would have to find a way of creating a voter register for this country. But I think that the voter turnout is far higher than what, the voter register may not even be as high as 87 million. You may not have 87 million voters, but certainly you had more than 25 million people who turned up for these elections. And it's a question for us. Maybe more people would have turned up, in fact. Maybe those that didn't even show up, removing those whose votes were suppressed, should have come out. But certainly, I think citizens, and that's why everybody's angry, citizens came out, they voted, and they were disappointed by the electoral management body.
You do some work, you consult for the National Assembly and the elections.
I don't consult for the National Assembly. What I do with the National Assembly is work with the National Assembly to provide technical assistance
Absolutely.
And support. And
that was what.
It's not a consultation.
Very well.
As a lawyer, I know what consultation means. It means I'm paid.
I know how involved you are with them,
that.
so that's where I was going with this. I was trying to draw your attention to the fact that the National Assembly elections held as well, and we saw quite some upsets. We would have a number of new lawmakers in the National Assembly, the 10th National Assembly. What does this mean for the country? Before we talk about perhaps the politics of it that led to the results we have now.
I think a couple of things. We have seen more than 80% return. Sorry, more than 80% not return. I've worked with the National Assembly closely since 2001. And have supported the National Assembly in different ways, and have also attended and supported the induction for new members of the National Assembly. Last year, the numbers dropped significantly of returnees. From the figures we're seeing now, it's very, very bad. And one of the things that PLAC has worked with the National Assembly on is to increase the number of women represented in the National Assembly. In the current Assembly, the 9th Assembly, there were just about 6 women in the Senate. As we speak this moment, and as we tally the numbers, we can clearly say that there are only 3 women, which is about half, returning. We're still working on getting the exact figures for the House of Representatives, but the numbers are, again, low because we have seen a lot of the women who were seeking re-election, some very good women, not come back or not win their elections. So for me, it's worrying that, again, you will have the learning process, and it takes you no less than 18 months as a new legislator to understand what the field is, and then before you know it, you begin to plot re-election. So that for me is worrying, the high turnover.
So how do we marry that with concerns of the average Nigerian that a lawmaker shouldn't spend 3, 4, 5, 6 terms in National Assembly? Because it would appear that there's jubilation when a lawmaker who's been there for maybe since 1999 or 2003 does not return.
Well, it might be jubilation in terms of local politics, because again, local politics has a way of turn by turn.
No, this is beyond the local politics. I'm saying the sort of conversation out there for young Nigerians who may not be familiar with parliamentary processes, who do not understand what you're saying with regard to how important it is to have lawmakers return and the consistency of lawmaking with vis-a-vis the knowledge and the time required to gather that knowledge to help the lawmaking process.
Yeah, I think it's useful to have legislators stay on for quite a while. Some have stayed on, though, and become unproductive, and I think that's you may see some people say, oh yeah, they don't need to come back. But the reality is experience counts a lot. And what saves a country's democracy is the parliament, the legislature. Unfortunately, I think that a lot of people are also seeing the legislature roll over when the executive kicks. And so you've seen a very subservient, and the 9th Assembly, that's really a huge conversation about among Nigerians about how subservient the 9th National Assembly has been. And that's why you have seen presidential nominations pass That's why you saw with the Electoral Commission that partisan elements were fielded as members of the Electoral Commission, especially at the REC level. So these are concerns that Nigerians have about the National Assembly. But there are quite a few National Assembly members who benefit from more terms and who contribute to the development of our democracy by the number of terms that they accomplish in the National Assembly. And you can't not appreciate that experience is useful with respect to legislative work.
All right, as we round off now, regardless of the situation of things and those in court, clearly 6 state governors, as at the time of this recording, have gone to court asking that the elections should be reconducted. But what obtains now, or what the fact we have on ground, is that we have a president-elect. Now, considering perhaps discontentment across the board with regards to perhaps the process of the election, and also the level of disunity in the country before the elections were conducted, what do you expect of the president in terms of how quickly he would act to address some of these issues? The president-elect, I beg your pardon.
Well, of course, without prejudice to the processes going on in courts, and we do hope that the courts will intervene in a just manner with respect to this issue. There are several outstanding issues in Nigeria at this time. One of it is the huge levels of discontent, the divisions created by the current administration that has seen segments of the country isolated and insulated from participation in governance. If you go to the southeast, it's a major concern how citizens feel that they have been completely marginalized in government. And looking at the fact that you have a president-elect that has a vice presidential candidate or elect who is from the same religion, there are still issues related to divisions in the country. And anyone who wants to succeed as president in this country must understand that these divisions have been deepened by this administration and seek to correct it. The discontent in the southeast is incredible. And the nature of certain types of government in the southeast who have frustrated citizens and who have refused to deliver on development is part of the crisis that the southeast, but also really the country is facing. So you must have a new president come in with a mindset to address the questions of division, the questions of insecurity around the country, the economic challenges. All of these are issues. And we must also remember what President Yar'Adua of blessed memory did after he was elected, which was to admit that the election that brought him to power in 2007 was deeply flawed. This election, the 2023 Nigeria general elections, is deeply flawed. It is shameful, and no one can gloss over the fact that we need to go back to the question of electoral reform.
Mr. Clement Nwankwo, thank you very much for always responding when I call.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you very much. Well, that's Political Paradigm. Thank you very much for your time as well. We have a president-elect now, barring any last-minute adjustments by the courts. The governorship and National Assembly elections come up really soon, 11th of March 2023. Don't be discouraged. Go out and vote. I like to think that the awareness at that level is even higher than that of the president, because those are the states know who to respond to in terms of their state assemblies, members of their state assemblies, and their governor. So hold your governor, hold your state House of Assembly member accountable. Choose the right people to make those decisions. That's where development starts from, the grassroots. Thanks for your time. Catch this episode and others on YouTube. Simply search Political Paradigm or go to channelstv.com. I'm Terry Ikumi. Goodbye.